Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video on Konoha Reviews. Today we take a look at the newest From Software title in the form of Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. There was a lot of hype working up to the release of this game, as it was a new franchise set in a new world by the famed creators of Dark Souls and Bloodborne. People had a lot of questions. Like, would it be similar to the old formula, in the sense that Bloodborne had a lot of similarities to its Souls brethren? How would the leveling mechanics work? Would you have allies fight beside you since the game was single player only? It is time to find out and dive deeper into this mystic game. More so than its predecessor, the story in Sekiro is told more directly in cutscenes that give the player more dialogue, both from NPCs but also now from the main character himself. Unlike the Soulsborne games, here one cannot customize and create their own character at the start. We are given a set character in the form of Wolf, a shamed shinobi who failed to protect the young lord he was assigned to, and now needs to get back to him. Despite there now being more dialogue and story present, it is all still quite cryptic and many things will go over one's head during the first playthrough. It is still way off from optimal storytelling in a game, but at least it is better than in Soulsborne. It is still way off from optimal storytelling in a game, but at least it is better than the Soulsborne, though the fantasy setting there gives fuel for your own imagination, where this is more grounded in reality despite there being clearly hints of fantasy in the form of demons, monsters, and magic. But the setting in and of itself is very cool, though comes with some limitations, and we will talk about that in a little bit. Sekiro at first plays like your typical third-person action RPG, and the movement and controls of the character immediately feel like the Soulsborne type. There are some major differences though that quickly become apparent. For one, you can now jump, and you can jump really high. This seems like a small or mundane change, but where the jump was always clunky in the Soulsborne games, here you can leap up to higher places or across ledges with ease. Another difference is that you quickly get introduced to the stealth mechanics that the game harbors. From Software originally created games in the Tenchu franchise, so ninja stealth has been something they had worked with in the past. The stealth mechanics presented in Sekiro are fairly standard, but it works, though it can be sometimes very iffy on the rules of being spotted by the AI. You have tall grass in some locations to hide and sneak behind an enemy to take him out in one hit. If one is above the enemy, the player can lunge down and take him out that way, or lure a single enemy out by throwing shards and taking the target out then. We've all seen it and done it before in other stealth games, but it is a welcome addition in a game like this. Sometimes you are facing a large group of enemies, and it is beneficial to take out the small fry first quietly before dealing with the larger foe. Here, unfortunately, a flaw presents itself as the stealth system can be exploited ridiculously. Often, when someone does an insta-kill on one of the enemies, chances are high that the player is spotted by others, and all enemies in the vicinity become aware. All the player needs to do then is run away far enough to where the enemies lose interest and return to their original position. Then the player can sneak up and kill another victim before repeating the process over and over again. It feels cheap and would have benefited from the enemies patrolling differently, or at least become aware sooner after they have lost interest. The fact that you can have different approaches like stealth or facing the enemies head on though is appreciated. I personally just wish one could customize the character more to also resemble a ninja, since that would fit the stealthy approach way more than a samurai warrior, a shinobi, or a ronin. The final and biggest difference compared to other titles in the From Software franchise is the combat system. I myself am a huge fan of the system used in the Soulsborne games, as it gives so much room to play around with and find a style to your liking. Do you prefer a one-handed sword and a shield? Go ahead. Do you like heavy hitters or two-handed broadswords? Take one. Do you want to dual wield or use long range to your advantage by using long axes and pikes? Here you go. How about some magic to spice things up? No problem. In Sekiro, unfortunately, your choices are a lot more limited. You always have your trusted katana in one hand and a prosthetic arm that can be modified to replicate certain weapon types like a heavy axe, a spear, a flamethrower, etc. And though you can upgrade these and unlock some new moves, you never feel as adept with them as with the weapons provided in the other games. It is a real shame because there are enough weapons and styles to be found in feudal Japan times that could have made the game feel very different despite providing a lot of weapons similar to previous titles. But of course, one always has his katana at hand, and it will do work for you, let me tell you. Where the pacing in the Soulsborne games was often decided by the player, here it is the opposite. In Dark Souls, one had the option to either use a shield to block, dodge out of the way, or parry to counter an incoming attack. In Bloodborne, Miyazaki wanted to get away from blocking and wanted the players to practice timing through rolling and dodging, and it is therefore interesting to see that he returns to the blocking, but most importantly, parrying aspect. Where you could swing away leisurely in Soulsborne, here the enemy will almost always block one or multiple attacks. As they block, an orange bar fills under their health bar, resembling their posture. Once the bar is full, it means they have lost their posture and are opened for a death blow, an instant kill attack. Since the enemies are often fighting very defensively, it is not the best strategy to just wail on them, hoping that the bar will fill eventually. Smaller enemies and grunts can bring this experience just fine, but bigger and more advanced enemies require you to take them seriously and fight them in a style that resembles an epic duel. Rather than you hitting them, a preferred strategy is to wait for an incoming attack and block at the last second to initiate a parry which will fill up a large amount of their posture bar. This is what I meant where the player here does not decide the pacing, as the player is waiting patiently for the enemy to strike. Though you of course need to do this as well in the Soulsborne games, your movement options were a lot wider, not feeling as up close and personal as Sekiro does. But the same rules apply to the player as well. You can use block to avoid damage from most attacks, something that I as a veteran Dark Souls player needed a long time to come to terms with, as blocking there still takes damage. Whenever the enemy does an attack that you are unable to block, a red kanji will appear, warning the player of what is coming next. But even those unblockable attacks one can counter by unlocking and using certain moves. It all comes down to timing, to be patient and learning patterns and then hit the block button on the right time. Since the players can one-hit kill the enemies once their posture bar is full, it becomes more important to do this than to actually deplete their HP with normal slashes. What does happen though, when the player damages a foe, is that their posture will rise quicker and deplete slower, making it easier for the player to break the enemy's posture altogether. Because the combat is so heavily focused on parrying, countering, and time-based prompts, it is really tiring to play in long sessions as you need to concentrate to get the timing right. And that is just the thing. I don't really like to just wait for one button to press over and over again. I prefer the freedom of the Soulsborne combat mechanics by a mile. Though it has to be said that I've talked to multiple friends who are really into fighting games, and they love Sekiro's combat mechanics. In some ways, it actually resembles a fighting game, since you have multiple titles that deal with counters and grapples as well. For them, this was a blast, and therefore I would argue too that Sekiro actually has a higher learning curve for those who are used to the Soulsborne games. Every time I approached a fight or a boss like I did in Dark Souls, I got my ass kicked, and so I had to flip a switch and play more defensively and patient. The bosses are of course always a highlight in games from Software, and here too you will face some really cool opponents. Though again, as mentioned before, the setting is actually holding things back here. Now don't get me wrong, I love the world they created, and the style is way more coherent than any From Software game before, but I feel like they could have taken things further. Though you will be facing a lot of different enemies, the enemy variety is not as good as previous titles because they are stuck to this one setting. You will be facing samurai and soldiers of all kinds, but most of the enemies will be humanoids. Other types you will be facing are roosters, grasshoppers, monkeys, wolves, or centipedes. But the weird thing here is that the earlier mentioned animals look rather mundane, and the studio could have done so much more to make them look unique and cool. Animal designs in previous From Software games was off the charts, as you had armored boars, dogs with knives in their mouths, crows with crippled paws, giant spiders, and more. It is therefore a little strange that they did not push the animal design further, as it is clear from the get-go that mythical creatures are a thing of reality in this world. The bosses themselves are also often humanoid, though there are of course exceptions and a few really cool twists and surprises. The fact that so many bosses are human is not necessarily a bad thing, since once again it feels like a cool samurai duel, but the other issue is that we have seen many of the boss types in other games. Bosses like a demon mask wearing monk with a giant spear is something we have seen in other games with a setting like Nioh. Or even the mounted samurai on his horse is something we have seen in games like Ninja Gaiden. The one thing that the Soulsborne games had was that they were limitless in their possibilities, and therefore you encountered some of the most unique looking bosses ever in video games. But again, the problem with that is that the world and setting might not feel as coherent, which is something that Sekiro definitely does. Despite the boss types being familiar, the fights themselves are often very cool and unforgiving. A highlight is a brutal duel against your former mentor in a burning building with a giant Buddha in the background. This fight in and of itself actually resembles an old school Dark Souls formula, as the boss attacks are very close range, and thus dodging and attacking works like a charm, much like what I was used to, which is probably why I like that battle so much. From Software once again succeeds in making the approach to the bosses quite different, despite having less weapons and playstyles to deal with. Another boss I had to fight constantly attacked me and would not stagger by a single hit that I did. Therefore, it was a much better strategy to constantly block and then vault over him to fill up his posture bar. I eventually killed him without doing any damage. It is also important to note that many of the bosses require you to perform multiple death blows. In some ways this represents them turning into a second stage, but for the mini-bosses, it is also often an option to sneak up on them and perform a death blow immediately so you only have to fight it once. Rewards given by these bosses are often items that when combined will increase your HP and attack power. The pacing of the game is therefore more dictated by the creators themselves, though I have to say that I feel that there's a bit more grinding required here, as you only get certain skills or powers by leveling at certain sculptures which require you to have grinded certain amounts of levels. I also found it a bit of a shame that certain enemies or bosses are clearly designed to be fought with a certain prosthetic in mind. Again, this limits the type of approach that you had to your free disposal in previous games. But it is not impossible though, which I experienced firsthand, as the first boss that I defeated, I did so by killing and dodging, rather than first getting a fire upgrade, which would have made the battle a lot easier, or unlocking the ability to slash at the enemy with the useful grappling hook. And speaking of this new feature, movement vertically is even emphasized more after you get access to the grappling hook early in the game. I was at first afraid that I would constantly see icons everywhere on the screen on where I could latch on to pull my character upward, but that is not the case. You can only use your grappling hook on specific areas like outsticking tree branches or ornaments on rooftops. It is easy to use and offers more than just journeying vertically. If one becomes overwhelmed by the enemies, it is a quick escape route that is often provided. Because of the grappling hook being such an essential tool in the game, the level design is very different and the most vertical in any From Software game to date. Rather than a compact world like the first Dark Souls or Bloodborne, it is more sprawling with areas stretching out from the beginning, much like Dark Souls 2 did. But the zones in and of themselves often rise, and when you start at the bottom, you can already see how high you will eventually need to climb to get to your objective. The areas are varied, and offer beautiful locations like ancient Japanese castles, villages, your more typical dungeons and caves, or a beautiful forest along the cliffs during autumn season. Some of the highlights for me were the mentioned forest with beautiful vibrant colors accompanied by the quaint Shinto Buddhism aesthetic that is used. Since I have been living in Japan for the last 7 years and have traveled to the countryside multiple times, I recognized a lot of details that others would skip right past. The sight of a hill filled with Yiso statues commemorating deceased children, complete with pinwheels, made me happy to see that such detail had been put in keeping the tone of the game to its aesthetic. Another highlight is a Japanese castle, where you move from rooftop to rooftop, ever going higher and higher, while fighting ninja-like assassins. You sweep and swoop all over the place, and I was astounded by how far the level design actually brought you up. It was exhilarating fighting the enemies at this height. Despite the zones themselves feeling more separate and spread out comparable to Dark Souls 2, which I actually dislike more compared to the compact worlds like DS1 and Bloodborne, there are many secrets to find and paths that diverge from the main one to be discovered. There's much more to be said or discussed about Sekiro, like the fact that when you die, you lose half of your XP for that certain level that you are heading towards and large amounts of useful money. There's the Dragon Rot mechanic or the Unseed Aid mechanic, which is important for lore as your character becomes sicker and sicker the more resurrections you use. But in the end, I believe Sekiro to be an absolute stellar game that delivers on a very cool world to explore in what is to date From Software's most different title compared to Dark Souls and Bloodborne. The stealth and combat systems accompanied by the verticality with the grappling hook makes the game stand on its own two legs alongside its two big brothers. Despite that though, I do have to say that I like both Dark Souls and Bloodborne better. The timing-focused combat system in Sekiro is less to my liking than the other games, and the lack in enemy variety, though not as bad as a game like Nioh, is a disappointing measure. I am glad to see that From Software is expanding, as it probably gave them the freedom to try out new things. I am happy to say that Sekiro Shadows Die Twice receives an 8.7, an excellent first entry in hopefully a cool and long-lasting franchise. There's much more for me to discover in the game itself, and like all From Software titles, I will do a second run with the help of a walkthrough to see what things I have missed during my initial one. Let me know if you have tried this title as well, and what your thoughts are on it. Until then, see you guys next time on Konoha Reviews.